Hi everyone, my name is Meenatchi Odaiyappan. I'm a fourth year political science administrative studies major at UCR, and I'll be presenting my honors capstone project today on the effect of party systems in climate change decision making, which I conducted under the guidance of Dr. Yasmin Iropoglou-Cadedes, my faculty mentor. So before I begin, I want to give some acknowledgement, first of all, to my faculty mentor for guiding me throughout this whole process, the UCR Honors Program for supporting me in completing this research, and finally, my family and friends who have been with me every step of the way. So my presentation is divided in three sections. The introduction, which will give everyone some background information, the country cases, where I look more deeply into each country, and finally, my analysis, where I provide you my analysis of the research. So let's get started with the introduction. So my presentation or my research was guided by the veto player framework established by George Tessabilis in his 1995 paper. And he defined a veto player as a person or a group of people who are able to stop change or allow it to happen. And this is pretty important in government. And in this, he highlighted two important groups, the institutional veto players and the partisan veto players. Institutional veto players are veto players that gain formal power from the Constitution and its our institutions. Examples of this are Germany's Bundestag, France's National Assembly, and the UK's House of Commons. Partisan veto players, on the other hand, are kind of different. They are the parties within a government, and they're determined by the party system and election system of that government. They only are really relevant when legislators have strong loyalty to their parties and act in accordance to their parties. Examples of partisan veto players include Germany's Christian Democratic Union, France's National Rally, and the UK's Conservative Party. The main argument that Tessabilis makes is that the more veto players there are that are less similar in policy positions, the less likely policy change is going to occur. And I use this to inform my own research. So I hypothesized that the more partisan veto players with power in government, the less likely climate change legislation will pass due to conflicting views. And for each of my countries, I look at five main things: the country's government, the party system, the relevant parties to the current administration, the legislative process and the number of veto players, and finally, in my research paper, I look at two examples of climate change decision-making with a focus on partisan veto players. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be talking about one example for each country. So the countries I picked Germany, France, and the United Kingdom because all three of them are European countries, and they have similar government and party systems, which allows me to compare them and really get a good understanding of why their party systems affect their climate change decision making. So without delay, let's start with Germany. Germany is a parliamentary government, and it has two main institutions, the Bundesrat and the Bundestag. The Bundesrat represents the 16 regions of Germany, and you can see those regions in the picture to your left. And the main job of the Bundesrat is to pretty much advocate for the 16 regions of Germany when it comes to the federal government and the EU. The Bundestag, on the other hand, represents all of Germany. It's not restricted by region. And as such, its responsibility is to act on behalf of the German people. So let's go into Germany's party system now. Germany has a multi-party system which means that a lot of different parties are involved in the government. There is no clear one dominant party or no clear two dominant parties. All parties really have a chance to stay in the government. And in German elections, the parties fight for the 736 seats available in the Bundestag. However, because of the multi-party system and the unique German elections process, no party can gain an absolute majority in the German Bundestag. Instead, parties have to form coalitions to gain a majority, which means formal alliances with other parties. So currently, in the 20th electoral term, the coalition in power is called the Traffic Light Coalition. And that coalition consists of the SPD party, the Alliance 90, the Greens party, and the FDP party. So, as you can see in the picture before, Germany has a lot of political parties. But for the purposes of this research, I focus on the ones most relevant to the administration and to climate change. The first party I looked into was the Christian Social Union, which was the previous majority party leader and the leader of the previous coalition called the Grand Coalition. The Grand Coalition consisted of the CDU, the CSU, its sister party, and finally the SPD. Moving on, the other three parties I focused on are the Social Democrat Party, the Alliance 90, the Greens Party, and the Free Democrats Party. Because all three of these parties create the Traffic Light Coalition, which is the current coalition in power. And like the Christian Social Union, they've also voiced support for climate change legislation. And then finally, the fifth party I concentrated on was the Alternative for Germany, which is Germany's populist party. And the party has been pretty outspoken on its disbelief that climate change is a thing. But due to their very low seat count in the Bundestag, even though they don't believe in climate change, they have no say in climate change legislation due to their low seat count and very little veto power. So, to get a better understanding of how the party system leads to partisan veto players, it's very useful to look at one of the acts Germany passed, and I chose the Renewable Energy Act of 2021. This act was introduced by the federal government, which at the time was led by the Grand Coalition to help redo Germany's renewable energy plan. Once it was introduced by the federal government, the act went to the Bundestag to vote. And in the Bundestag, the Grand Coalition had a absolute majority, meaning that they have enough seats to pass legislation on their own with no support from opposition party, which is exactly what happened with the Renewable Energy Act. It passed the Bundestag with 0 votes from opposition, which is the other parties in the German government. Then the bill went to the Bundesrat for a vote, and then finally was passed into law. This showcases how the Grand Coalition was able to quickly pass their bill with no support from opposition because of their absolute majority. The party system created partisan veto players of the three Grand Coalition parties because they pretty much control the Bundestag. As such, because the partisan veto players were aligned in their agreement on the act, the bill was passed quickly. However, it's also true if they weren't aligned, then the bill might not have passed or would have passed with some major amendments. So let's move on to France next. France is a semi-presidential system, and the two main institutions in France are the National Assembly and the Senate. The National Assembly is directly elected by the people compared to the Senate, which is elected by indirect universal suffrage. As such, the party system in France mainly affects the National Assembly. France's party system is a multi-party system. And unlike Germany, though, it's possible for a party in France to gain an absolute majority. And when parties fight for the 577 seats in the National Assembly, they also fight to elect a French president. Ideally, the president of France and the National Assembly majority are of the same party through this election process. However, that's not always the case. And in the case the president and National Assembly majority come from different parties, that's a situation called cohabitation, which is not ideal because while the president has one agenda, the National Assembly majority has another. And this prevents bills from being passed and a lot of gridlock in the French government. So the three political parties I focused on for France are the Renaissance Party, which is the current French president's party, Emmanuel Macron. Currently, the party has lost its absolute majority in parliament in the recent elections and therefore has to form an alliance with the Horizons and Democrat parties. The Alliance and Renaissance Party have voiced support for climate change policies. Following that up is the National Rally, which is the populist party in France and the second leading party. In the past, the National Rally has expressed no support for climate change, but in recent years has expressed support for climate change due to voter interest. And then finally, a new alliance formed with four parties is called a NUPS Alliance. This alliance was formed by the Europe Ecology the Greens Party, the Socialist Party, the French Communist Party, and the La France Insoumise Party. These four parties was created in alliance in opposite to Renaissance, and they're a strong believer of climate change. So similar to Germany, let's get a better idea of how this party system affects climate change legislation in France. So the Climate and Resilience Law was originally introduced as a referendum by President Emmanuel Macron. As such, it was introduced by the federal government. Once it was introduced, it then went to a National Assembly for vote. And at the time, the Renaissance Party had an absolute majority in the National Assembly. Therefore, it was able to easily pass the National Assembly with little to no changes. However, this wasn't the case when the bill went into the Senate. In the Senate, the Renaissance Party does not have a majority. Instead, the Republicans Party does. And because they did not agree with a lot of things that were written in the bill, they amended the bill in the Senate. And then once this amendment was complete, then the bill went to a joint committee consideration, which is pretty much a way of saying that the National Assembly and Senate came together to agree on the wording for the bill. And once this was agreed on, it went into law. So while the Renaissance Party was a partisan veto player in the National Assembly, it wasn't in the Senate. And having two different partisan veto players created a watered down bill from the starting point. And it showcases how even though the party system affects the partisan veto players, it can't always control it because the Senate isn't elected by the people. And finally, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a parliamentary government similar to Germany. It has two important institutions, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons is the institute that's publicly elected by the people. In comparison, the House of Lords is appointed, and as such, they aren't elected to their positions. And for this reason, the party system mainly affects the House of Commons. So the UK, unlike the other two countries, has a two-party system. And don't get me wrong, this does not mean the UK just has two parties. It means that the government is dominated by two parties, even though there's multiple parties. And in this case, it's the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And this is because the first past the post election system in the UK prevents smaller parties from really entering the majority. And it's also designed to make sure that the House of Commons is ruled by an absolute majority or at least a majority. Because the UK wants a one-party government, and this allows for the easy passage of legislation in one singular thought. So let's move on to the political parties in the UK. The UK has four main ones I concentrated on. The Conservative Party, which is the current majority party in the UK, and it has expressed support for climate change, but is very conservative on the issue. The Labour Party is the current opposition party, and they've also acknowledged climate change and are trying to push for more climate change legislation. The Green Party is the UK's climate change focused party and really focuses on implementing climate change into all legislation. And then finally, the UK Independent Party is the populist party in the UK. But unlike the other parties, the UK Independent Party has no seats in the House of Commons, meaning that even though it's a political party, it has no partisan veto player powers because it doesn't even have a seat in the institutions that run legislation. So let's look at the Environment Act of 2021, which is one of the UK's climate change acts in recent years. The bill was first introduced in the House of Commons by the Conservative Party, where it then went to a House of Commons vote. In the House of Commons, the Conservative Party has an absolute majority, which allowed them to pass the legislations with very little amendments they did not agree upon from opposition parties. It then went into the House of Lords for a vote and finally was passed into law. This showcases how the party system creates an absolute majority, and the absolute majority party, which in this case is the Conservative Party, becomes a partisan veto player that can influence how legislation works. And it shows how one strong partisan veto player with an absolute majority is really able to control the climate change legislation. So my analysis of all this is, do party systems matter? They absolutely do. They determine which parties have partisan veto player powers because of it determines who's in the majority. And whoever's in the majority, their stances on climate change will be more listened to than any of the other parties because they don't have a say in really how the government works. The exception being Germany with its coalition government. It also showcases that when parties have conflicting views on climate change legislation, like in the sense of France, the bill might not be passed or will be passed a very watered down version of its intent. And based on all this, I came to a conclusion that party systems do matter and that the more partisan veto players they are with less similar climate change views, the less likely we're going to get climate change legislation to solve the problem. And that's it. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we're open to questions.
Thank you so much, Meenatchi. And I'll just remind you to stop recording right now.